Welcome everyone. This is Jody King with the Alaska PTAC. I want to welcome everyone to our webinar today. We're going to talk about managing contract changes. And before I get started, I just want to go over the GoToWebinar panel, pull a few things to your attention. I want to encourage questions because it looks like it's going to be a pretty small group of us today, and we want to have that discussion as much as possible. So there's two different ways you can ask questions. One, you can enter the question clicking on the question section in the GoToWebinar panel, or you can simply click the raise hand feature. I can unmute you from this side, and then you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask those questions. The next thing I'd like to pull attention to is the handout section of the webinar. I have uploaded a copy of the slides, so we can see that there, managing contract changes. If for any reason you are unable to download that document, feel free just to email me. You can always reply to your webinar invitation, email me, request the handouts, and I'll be glad to send that to you. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be talking about managing contract changes. And part of managing contract changes is truly to develop a systematic approach on how to administer that contract change. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about today are how to identify change, the change clauses, what's in your contract, identifying and tracking costs, internal and external communication, documenting the go-ahead, change orders, requests for equitable adjustment, claims, and disputes. So let's talk about how does all of this come about. So remember the days back when we learned how to flow chart. So this is kind of just a rough and obviously doesn't include everything that could possibly have, but it gives us kind of a skeleton of the process. So we have a solicitation that's issued, and the contract's executed, performance begins, and suddenly things have happened. A change has been triggered. Either the performance start date has changed, the supply schedule might have changed, the color of the paint to be provided, any kind of possibility in addition to subtraction of the scope of work. So somehow through that completion of that scope of work, we have a change that has been triggered. So here's our thinking process. Was that change initiated by the agency? Well, yes, it was. And by agency, was it driven by the contracting officer? Was it by the contracting officer's representative? Or was it another agency employee that is commenting on the process? So initiated by agency, yes. And here's our question. Does that individual have the authority to do so? Well, if yes, then we're going to go over to A in this process, and we'll come back to that for a second. What if it's not initiated by the agency? Well, hop down here. Was it initiated by the prime? So this is your contract and you notice an error, something's wrong, some issue. So yes, it was initiated by the prime. So does this impact the cost, the performance, or the cost? Well, yes, it does. So again, we're going to come back to A, and we'll deal with that in a second. No, it wasn't initiated by the prime. Was it initiated by a sub or a vendor? Well, yes, it was. Is it a valid change? Because again, if we remember that contract privity is between the agency and that prime contractor, but when you do have vendors and subs, that actually can impact the process and the completion. So we want to know, is that a valid change? No, not necessarily. Well, maybe you need to negotiate and discuss that with your prime contractor, because it could be terms or something within, but it doesn't actually impact the overall scope, the completion of that performance work statement or that scope of work. And yes, if it is a valid change, well, here we come back here. So remember when I hopped that initiated by prime, we said, yes, does this impact performance or cost? No, it really doesn't. Well, maybe we want to, and this can kind of ties back to the negotiate, discuss, you want to adjust that project plan in coordination with your subs. But let's talk about if we have this yes. So hopping down to the screen down here, these are the communication process that really needs to be triggered before that change can be implemented. So we're going to send an email to the contracting officer requesting authorization. And even if you pick up the phone and call and leave a message, that voicemail should be promptly followed up with an email, because ultimately we want that communication in writing. You want to email the contracting officer's representative, the core. Sometimes you'll see that COTAR, contracting officer technical representative, verifying request. And this honestly could even be the same email where you've contacted both of them. You want an internal email to notify the project manager, your accounting, your contract administration, or even if it is just you and you are the owner operator for this program, you want to send yourself an email at a minimum if you need that reminder that, hey, there has to be stuff done. Whether you do recorded notes to yourself, but somehow you have to remember, if you are the team, then there's things that need to be discussed. And you need that external team email notification as well. So in the case of a construction contract, if we have some change that's triggered up here, and we've kind of run our little logic train and okay, it's a valid change and it's going to impact that timeline or that cost, well, we need to have communication of that process. Let's look at this from another way. So that contract change flow, we acknowledge we have a change. Here, we're beginning that communication process. And so after that change is acknowledged, so the change is confirmed by the contracting officer. And you may ask, well, why is this important? Because we have that privity of contract and that contract has been executed by the contracting officer and we are beginning that contract process, only the contract officer has the authority to approve contract changes, to approve, especially if there's going to be a cost or a time delay. So any of that's going to impact that work production, you need to have that confirmation by the contracting officer, especially if there's going to be an impact to the price. So the change is confirmed. So here's kind of our skeleton of what's going to happen. Change is confirmed by the contracting officer. They provide the contract change proposal to the contracting officer. Now, again, we have our little document icon, and this is contracting officers agreed, yep, we have an issue. Now we need to begin to negotiate. So we're going to start by proposing that cost of said change. So we enter that negotiation. And depending on the type of contract, such in the case of construction, where we have an impact to the subcontractor work as well, we might need to get their documentation added to ours that we're getting to that contracting officer. So now we begin those negotiations. A type of modification is determined, or if it's needed, maybe the change is more of a clarification of scope and it's agreed upon that there isn't necessarily a cost change, but we need to have that confirmation of, say it's a paint color or a different materials or a different system or a different start date. You need to have that in writing for proof of that performance throughout that life of the contract. So we're going to talk about it as a bilateral mod or a unilateral mod. And then I'm going to talk about these definitions a little bit more. So yes, it is. Both parties are going to sign that modification. And yes, they incorporate change and continue performance. No, in the case of a unilateral mod, and this could be where the contracting officer says, okay, we agree, such and such paint color is not available. This is an appropriate substitute. And you have that in writing. Maybe if that paint was called out in the solicitation, that mod is then made, and it's not going to require a signature of both parties. Again, that mod is issued to you, it's incorporated, continue performance, and either way you incorporate change to subcontractor agreements if it's applicable, so if it impacts subcontractor work. So this is really great, like all things on paper. Looks simple. We kind of pack here, yep, solicitation, got my contract, begin performance. Somebody raised a hand and said, nope, do this instead. And from there, everything gets really crazy. And so it's really easy to talk about how to manage contract change when we are removed from the actual situation. Not all relationships are as easily negotiated, communicated with all parties involved. But the point is, we have to have some sort of process where you're identifying that change and you're starting to track it and cost it and begin those conversations. In some cases, if it's significant enough, there's that determination, do we need to stop work before proceeding? And in most cases, the reality is, no, we really can't. There's things dependent upon that timeline. But now this is where today's workshop about learning what all constitutes a change and talking about identifying, tracking those change factors and building a good administrative process into your work environment is going to save you in the long run. So let's move on. Okay. Oops, excuse me one second. There we go. So let's talk about what the FAR has to say, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. So we have FAR Part 43, which talks about contract modification. And it's the types of contract modifications where we have bilateral and unilateral. So we saw that on this slide before. And quite simply, a bilateral modification or supplemental agreement is a contract modification that is signed by the contractor and the contracting officer. And it gives you a couple ideas what bilateral modifications are used to do. Negotiate equitable adjustments resulting from the issuance of a change order. So obviously, if it's pulling it out right here in the FAR and it's item number 1, well, this is a very important factor. We're negotiating those equitable adjustments. Definitize letter contracts and reflect other agreements of the party modifying the terms of the contract. There has to be agreement when you modify the terms. And of course, negotiation if there's a cost impact directed from the modification of terms. So a unilateral modification is a contract modification that is signed only by the contracting officer. Unilateral modifications are used, for example, to make administrative changes. Maybe you have a different COR or COTAR than what we thought the contract was going to start with. Issue change orders, make changes authorized by clauses other than the changes clause, i.e. property clause, options clause, suspension of work, and issue termination notices. So there are some powers that the federal agency, Uncle Sam, has where they can say, nope, you don't have a choice, and thus the unilateral. But note here, under bilateral, when we talk about negotiated costs and agreements for modification of terms, that does require a bilateral signature. So, notification of contract change. We're still under FAR Part 43. Let me go ahead and pull back my little pointer. All right, so Part A, when a contractor considers that the government has affected or may affect a change in the contract that has not been identified as such in writing and signed by the contracting officer, it is necessary that the contractor notify the government in writing as soon as possible. So here we have it right here, Federal Acquisition Regulation states, if the government has affected or may affect a change, you need to get that writing to the contract, get that in writing to the contractor as soon as possible. This will permit the government to evaluate the alleged change and, 1, confirm that it is a change, countermand the alleged change, or notify that the contractor that no change is considered to have concerned. Pretty straightforward. The clause 52-243(7) notification of change, and here's the description of that under FAR Part 43-107, but that FAR clause incorporates the policy expressed in paragraph A of this section, requires the contractor to notify the government promptly of any government conduct that the contractor considers a change to a contract, and specifies the responsibilities of the contractor and the government with respect to notifications. So here is whenever we have a FAR part that's anything other than 52, which is our clauses and provision, This is the descriptive, the explanation. This is defining it for both the contracting officers and for the contractors of here's how the process is outlined. The FAR clause actually makes that process a part of your contract and contract compliance. So that clause right there is one, it gives the contractor a reason and a process and a channel of how to negotiate and how to reach out to the contracting officer, because the language is there. It's there to protect both parties of that. And it also says, hey, you have to give the government notification. You've got to let the contracting officer know. All right, availability of funds. So this is really critical. So if we are going to begin to negotiate, first the contracting shall, let me start over. The contracting officer shall not execute a contract modification that causes or will cause an increase in funds without first obtaining a certificate of fund availability. So part of that negotiation is what can the agency afford? Is there funds? Are we, pushing down into the end of a fiscal year? What's available? And that becomes part of that negotiation stream as well. Are the funds conditioned? Is the change conditioned on the availability of funds? And two, contain a limitation of cost or funds clause. So the certification required by paragraph A of this section shall be based on the negotiated price, except the modifications executed before agreement on price may be based on the best available estimate of cost. So if you remember in our little flow sheet, a few slides up, we said change is acknowledged, and we have already notified the contract. The change is like, okay, yes, we do have a change. This is part of that notification system, which then rolls into that negotiation. Next, okay, I got to stop hopping around on you guys. Let me change cursors. All right, so we talked about availability of funds. And next, the FAR continues to say the government contracts contain a changes clause that permits the contracting officer to make unilateral changes in designated areas within the general scope of contract. And two, Part B, the contractor must continue performance of the contract as changed. Can anybody say when you would stop performance due to a potential change? One, we would want to see a stop work notice from the contracting officer. And two, if there's concerns of health and safety issues, if there's an immediate safety or health risk, and we might halt, do a stop change. But if it is the contractor saying we got to stop, boy, you really do need to make sure that you have that contracting officer, your COR, supporting that so that you are not then penalized that you didn't continue performance. In this paragraph, this 43201B, the contractor must continue performance, is one of the biggest snarls in the entire managing change processes, because sometimes those changes, we can't get a fast yes or no, or we have to negotiate, where it really does have a major change to the entire impact of that performance. However, we can't all stop. There are also times where possibly the government isn't responding as quickly as we need. And again, short of that health and safety factor, that performance has to continue. And often this leaves the contractor making a decision on the fly. Are we going to incorporate what's the reasonableness of this change? What's our immediate impact? Do we want to move forward and risk that additional cost? Do we want to take a moment, reflect on how is our relationship with this contracting officer, with the representative, with that particular agency? Have we had to negotiate changes before? What's our experience with this owner? Do we want to continue or not? And ultimately, contract states you must continue performance. This is where, once that decision is made internally of whether you're going to stop or continue on, or if you can adjust until you get response on that change, you want to start tracking that start developing a timeline. And this is where we talked about on the little flow chart where you're emailing your external communication group, and internal, external if it's subs or vendors, that internal for the project manager, your accounting person, your contract administrator, if you have one. The last sentence I want to pull out here, 43202, change orders shall be issued by the contracting officer except when authority is delegated to administrative contracting officer. Still note contracting officer. So even if the Corps, or if you're on a military base and the general, the base commander comes through and says, yes, you are going to do this, keep in mind they are not the warranted individuals that are going to guarantee that they can pay you for that cost differential if there is a cost differential. And keep in that mind that any changes are always going to impact time or cost, often both. Okay, moving on. There we go. Get the mouse to be sensitive here. All right, administrative. Again, we're still part 43, administration, change order documentation. And I've already kind of started talking about this. So as the FAR defines, when change orders are not forward priced, they require two documents, the change order and a supplemental agreement reflecting the resulting equitable adjustment in contract terms. So if we hop down to 1BA, it says contracting officers shall negotiate equitable adjustments resulting from change order in the shortest practical time. Now, it doesn't give a time turnaround, shortest practical time. And often that shortest practical time is when the contracting officer has time. So if you are submitting that request for a change order, and it talks about forward price, so if you can provide an estimate immediately upon notifying or not, one of the things that you should do, just good practice, is notify the contractee the urgency of the response. Is this something that we can take a couple of days to decide, or is this potential change something that is going to hold everything up and we can't move forward? So if we can let the contracting officer know, one, we either do have a price of the potential cost or we will get that to them shortly, but two, what is the timeline to make sure that we don't have a significant delay in impact? Because that allows the contracting officer to prioritize their desk. So now the FAR doesn't state that, but again, it's part of that courteous communication with your contracting officer and building that request. Everyone, of course, is going to feel that everything needs immediate attention, and then the contracting officer is making that determination without necessarily understanding the urgency of that process. So keep that in mind as well. So if you can request a timeline and provide why you need that response sooner rather than later. So administration continued, paragraph 5, the contracting officer requires a field pricing review of requests for equitable adjustment. And here it kind of breaks it down, dollar and data contract, data submission of initial contract proposal, delay of alleged delays, disruptions, performance date. So anything that is going to impact, but immediately we need that field pricing review. So even if we can just give an estimated cost with a confirmed price to follow up. And finally, under this last component of administration, so we have the complete and final equitable adjustments. To avoid subsequent controversies that may result from a supplemental agreement containing an equitable adjustment as a result of a change order, the contracting officer should, 1, ensure that all elements of the equitable adjustment have been presented and resolved, and 2, include the supplemental agreement, include with the supplemental agreement a release similar to the following. And this is great language that if you have to roll that change down to a subcontractor to look at adding that same type of release, statement of release against additional funds or future funds, somebody coming back down the road and saying, oh, hey, that change, I forgot to add this cost. So if the FAR is saying, hey, contracting officers, do this, it's a pretty solid adjustment for you all to look at this for your subcontractor management. So if you do have subcontracts on that particular project and they do have subcontract agreements, do we want to include this process for that as well? Contract modification, the contract clauses, and I'm not going to read this for you, but I did want you to have the information. I just highlighted them. These are the avenues in which we can incorporate change to an executed contract. So we have this first one, 52-243-1, changes in fixed price, 243-2, changes in cost reimbursement, and you can see really these are just particular clauses depending on the type of contract. Again, changes time and material. Here's the overall statement. Changes clause 52-243-4 and 5, changes in change condition. And again, here's an optional clause. The contracting officer may insert change order accounting. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. There's nothing more fun than a long retracted discussion of the FAR, but I do want to let you all have that information. All right, so let's talk about identifying change. We talked about it from that FAR perspective of here's our process, but really, how are we going to know, is it truly? Okay, I just had a little note saying my audio had dropped for a minute. If you don't hear me, someone raise hand. Okay. All right, thank you, everybody. Sorry about that delay. All right, contract interpretation. So this is the process of determining what the parties agreed to in their bargain. And I pulled this right off a legal website. So in scope versus out of scope. And I've linked an article from SmallGovCon that really has a great description, and they incorporated a GAO explanation of the difference of in scope versus out of scope. So let's talk terminology. So first of all, we have a cardinal change, which is an out of scope change that is not within the general scope of the original contract in terms of type and amount of work, period of performance, and manner. So we have what it is, when it's to be performed, and the how is it to be performed. So there's a possible, they can determine those cardinal change, either the percentage of price comparison formula, and this one is probably the most known as far as the contracting world. Sometimes the agencies say, well, if it's 20% over or 20% of the overall contract price, I'm not going to go into this too much, but I just want to let you know that there's these processes, percent of change comparison formula. And then this cardinal change, is it significant enough that it should be a new bid, or is it a reasonable extension and or change of the existing scope? So if I say that we're just going to use painting. I have a paint project at home that I start next week, so obviously painting is front and center on the brain for me today. But if we have a painting contract and we're going to do, we say we have 700 square feet in main area and we're going to paint, and then suddenly the contracting officer comes back and says, hey, we want to do this additional 30 square feet. We've decided to add an office or a kitchen area for the paint. Now, this is where the contracting officer has to come in. Is this a cardinal change? When we look at that percent of price comparison, that cost of that 30 additional square feet in comparison to the overall 700 square feet, is that a reasonable extension? Or if I say, hey, because same area, it's adjacent, but then if I come back and say I have a second building or another floor where we have a distinct, and I want to add an additional 600 square feet of painting, now we're looking at that. Is that a cardinal change? Is it significant enough that it could be bid separately? And of course, most of you, if you have that paint contract, you're willing to sit down and negotiate that cost different without having to go through a bid process. However, if you're a competitor that didn't get the original award and you find out that suddenly the contracting officer is adding or doubling the work of that original contract that could have impacted your price in your process, and you don't get a second bite at that apple, obviously this becomes a protestable situation. So the contracting officer has to be aware of that. That is that whole phrase, cardinal change. First of all, we are agreeing it's out of scope, but now we're looking at how large out of scope. Is it a reasonable extension, or should it just go out for bid as a separate bid activity? Okay, unforeseen site conditions. In fact, we might even have that as a standard clause especially in construction contracts. Was there an unknown condition that would impact it? And again, like that cardinal change, this unforeseen condition, does this create a whole new set of circumstance that needs to be addressed separately, or is it a reasonable change? Was it possibly anticipated that there might have been unforeseen changes, and then they can continue? Then it could be determined, yes, it is a reasonable extension. Order of precedence clause. So again, we have, depending whether it's sealed bid or negotiated, most federal agencies are using negotiated procurement. There are still some that use sealed bidding, and sometimes we might still see sealed bidding for construction contracts. So there is a difference in process depending on the type of the contract process. Oops. And this duty to seek clarification. If a contractor fails to inquire about an ambiguous term or conflicting requirements prior to the contract, it forfeits the opportunity to rely on its interpretation and thus bears the risk of misinterpretation. Now, a lot of this information is pulled directly out of this book, Managing Contract Changes, and this is chapter 2. And I actually do have information on this book and how to order it from Amazon, just where we got it originally. So I do have that in the slide later on. So let's talk about this duty to seek clarification. And there's a great GAO history on defining of shame on you, contractor, you should have known better. And it comes down to this. So often, if we as contractors, we see a flaw in the contract, in the solicitation documents, in the plans, in the specifications, and we think, aha, I can fix this as a change order after award because I know it's not going to work. So I can come in, bid low, and then make up my money through change orders. Well, the government has started pushing back on that, and that's this duty to seek clarification. So if this goes before some sort of determining board as to the validity of your change request, and it is determined that you knew there were flaws and you didn't bring that to the attention of the contracting officer during the solicitation process, then I'm sorry, you took that risk and you are going to bear that risk, and it's not going to be identified as a change order. So it's been a lot of pushback, last decade or so, for contracting officers to encourage contractors to question the solicitation while it's still in the solicitation pre-award phase, to seek clarification, to have ambiguities clarified, as opposed to using them as I will get a change order on that down the road. So there has been a change in precedence on that. Just a heads up, we have a new webinar next month, January 12th, and I have more information on this. And Howard Roth, who is a fabulous attorney from Olds, good Lord, speaking well today, attorney, he's a partner with Olds, Morrison, Rink, and Brinker, who's going to be talking about REAs from a legal aspect. So this is one of those conversations that are going to be held. So I will save more discussion for that January workshop. Moving on. There we go. Okay. Change is triggered. What does the contract say? So we're still talking about identifying change. So how was the contract statement of work defined? So remember, this is kind of this little segment of our flow chart. Does this impact performance or cost? So how is the contract statement of work defined? Whether we have a statement of work, which is prescriptive, or scope of work, prescriptive, or performance work statement, which is performance-based. And having this prescriptive versus performance-based is really critical when we talk about what does the contract say. In a prescriptive written world, the government is telling you how it wants it done. It is defining its objectives, its end objectives, but it's also giving you the processes and says you will do this daily, you'll do this at this time, this process. And if we've determined that it's not functional, not working, and a change is then in effect, but because how we were told to do it isn't working and we need to change that process, well, then we have a point in which to begin that change conversation. In a performance-based performance work statement, the end objectives are identified, progress has defined goals, performance has defined minimum, maximum levels of acceptable standards, the process developed is submitted by the contractor. So prescriptive, the government says, here's how we want it done. In a performance-based, it is up to you all, now the contract awardee, to have determined how are you going to do it. So if you have discovered that your planned how we are going to do it needs adjustment, needs change, it's not necessarily a change to the contract. That is something, again, that's an internal modification that needs to be done. It isn't necessarily triggered or affected by something the government is doing. Now, if your processes are accepted and after you performing, the agency then determines, no, we really need to change a few things. We didn't really understand. We need to reset the goals, the levels of performance. We need to make adjustments. Here's why. Well, okay, now we are back to yes, now we do have a change in the contract versus adjusting how we thought we would run the contract. So this type of work statements, whether it's prescriptive or performance-based, really can have an impact on identifying change. And again, I've got a really great article on talking about prescriptive versus performance-based contracts, and I do have a link here on the slide. And again, for those of you that joined us late, I do have a copy of the slides that's uploaded under the documents section on your GoToWebinar panel. And if you're unable to download that document, you're welcome to email me and I'll be glad to send that to you. So change is triggered, what is the cost? Let's talk about how much, identifying that change. So what are the cost impacts? How are the costs being tracked? So accounting practice, project codes, how do you internally identify your direct costs for completing a contract? And for all of the training that I've done over the years, when it talks about contracting for change, they talk about you have your project accounting codes, but then you have a subset for change orders. And each new change then has a new accounting project code that we start identifying so that we can show that cost differential. So second things here of what are the estimates of the potential cost increase from your subs? So how are the costs being tracked and the actual cost versus the proposed cost? So one of the things that you're going to run into that it's not uncommon for the contracting officer to want to see your proposal working documents to see how your cost factor, how you built your costs, what were the factors, what were those baseline costs that they can then compare against the proposed cost for this change. And if you had contingency costs built in for additional materials, then they're going to look at, does this potential change fit reasonably with what you've already built into the cost for that contingency area? Again, thinking construction, if you have those type of contingency costs built in. So they do want to, or may ask to see those proposal working papers. And this is where having that accounting process where you're tracking those direct costs for that work completion, and now we have a subset process for tracking the cost of change, it gives us easier to compare from our proposed change. Here's our actual. We're tracking that cost against what we had proposed. Here's where this change has broadsided the contract, and now we can show that the costs that were impacted. So if we didn't have the change, we would have still been on target, but due to this change, we can show where those additional costs have come in. The better that you can show an accounting process to verify against your proposed, against your actual, and against that change, the stronger your negotiation point for will be that you do have, these are valid costs for that change. Next bullet, what are the time impacts? So again, we're always talking time and money. Who are the players in that project timeline? If there's liquidated damages, do we need to discuss? And again, it depends on what is that change. And again, if it's an effective change from government action, then you want to negotiate that time so that those liquidated damages, if it's applicable to your contract, aren't necessarily now suddenly on the table. Next bullet, what is the contract compliance impact? So if you are a service as opposed to construction, you have field reporting that you have to do, R&D type reports every so many months for the change. Again, look at the time impacts and make sure that you are addressing that as well as the cost of those changes. And let's talk about this last here, exchange of consideration. I've taken several DAU, Defense Acquisition University classes that are for contracting staff. And one of the things that they always talk about is consideration. So if the contractor is asking for a time delay without penalty, the contracting officer is taught to then ask, well, what are you going to give me in exchange? What is the consideration for our improvement? And when we start talking about in that term consideration, they're always referring to time or money. So keep that in mind as well as part of your negotiating process. If there is fund limitation, and we do have a significant cost, would it benefit your bottom line to have additional time for completion if there is a cost ceiling just because of availability of funds? So think about that when you're negotiating that change as well, both time and money, that exchange of consideration. Questions, anybody? And again, if you have questions, you can enter them in the question box, or you can simply click the raise hand feature, and I'll be happy to unmute you from this end and we can have that conversation. All right, moving on. Okay, identifying change in regards to subcontractors. So major challenges to subcontract. So the lack of a changes clause in their subcontract agreement can result in the inability to respond to a unilateral change. So keep in mind, an agency says you will, they're the only ones that sign, and you have a clause incorporated. So if you are in a world where the majority of your government projects, your involvement is as a subcontractor, think about these major challenges that we're going to go over and the lack of a changes clause in your subcontract agreement, and negotiate to have that in there so that you have that ability then to address the impact of changes as they're flowed down from the agency down. Poor communication with the prime contractor, again, challenges to subs, lack or subcontract change management process. So mostly I've been talking about the impact of change and the process of change for the prime contractor. But again, if your world is predominantly as a subcontractor, these processes are still applicable, except now that relationship is between you and your prime. And again, all of these things that we talked about for tracking communication, that gives more detailed information for your prime to then incorporate when they submit a request for equitable adjustment. So back to the challenges for subcontractors. So inadequate ability to manage the costs, schedule performance aspects of subcontract changes. Poor business behavior actions by the primes blaming subs for performance and management issues. Gosh, we've never heard of that, have we? Hey, government, I'm late because I have the worst subcontractors, or we're going to change out subcontractors. It's a great excuse. It's not necessarily true. So what happens again if you're that sub and you're being blamed? Unauthorized commitments by the prime contractor employees to the sub. So we have that breach of the role of management. Failure to meet contract subcontract performance obligations by the prime. So yes, what do you do as the subcontractor if the prime isn't managing the contract so that you can maintain your proposed cost? So there are these impacts that a prime contractor whose actions have impacted the performance of the contract, but not from an agency perspective, but as a subcontractor. And so these major challenges that we talked about really roll up to how is your contract ability to push upward to your prime when these are in place, and these actions are then impacting, if they're initiated by the prime, and they're impacting your cost performance. So this slide is really just my way of saying, hey, for all of you that are involved in subcontractors, negotiate those subcontract agreements. Make sure that there's a changes clause in your subcontract agreement that defines, should these circumstances happen, that you have a legal venue in which to resolve that. So my last statement here, like prime contractors, subcontractors encounter many challenges in the planning, pricing, negotiating, and implementing contract and subcontract changes. Types of authority. This one really is an issue when it comes to contract change. So we have apparent, implied, and express authority. And understanding these terminology really makes a difference. So apparent authority is the power of an agent to act on behalf of a principal, even though not expressly or impliedly granted. That's a tough word to say. This power arises only if a third party reasonably infers from the principal's conduct that the principal granted such power to an agent. And for each definition, I've given you a link to Law Cornell website, and it has a great information on identifying and then dealing with that. So apparent. Implied authority is the agent's power to act on behalf of a principal intentionally granted, please note, intentionally granted by the principal as a result of the principal's conduct, but without an express agreement. Failure to object after a prior exercise of such power may give rise to implied authority. Express authority is an agent's power to act on behalf of a principal explicitly granted by an agreement between agent and principal. Now, the reason that I pulled this definition from the law website as opposed right out of the FAR is because there are a lot of players. Now, the express authority, let me finish going here and then I'll come back. Actual authority is the agent's power to act on behalf of a principal because such power was expressly or impliedly conferred. Okay, so an example on this actual authority, a contracting officer is a person who can bind the federal government, the United States. Contracting officers hold warrants that allows them to negotiate on behalf of the United States government. So this is actual authority. As the government agencies, or I'm sorry, as the government's agent, only contracting officers may execute, modify, or terminate a contract. Now, part of that role for the contracting offices is they may then identify their contracting officer representatives. And in that case, a letter is issued to the COR that is giving them a limited authority and when they may or may not act and up to what limit they may act. And so now we're starting getting into guys, apparently I'm having an internet day. So as soon as I saw my little warning that I lost my audio, I paused. So let's go back. So the contracting officer, through that COR designation letter, then defines the limitation of authority that that COR or COTR may have. And they should be giving a copy of that letter to the contracting to that representative, as well as to the prime contractor. And it's going to define what the limitation and authority is. So please note that now we're talking about moving from actual authority to express authority, because again, it's been written, and then we have that apparent authority or implied authority, where really it's the behavior. So if we have that general for base coming through and says, no, I want this, or we have manager or another party not necessarily involved in that day-to-day that starts saying, well, I am so-and-so, I'm in charge of the budget, you guys are spending my money, I decide what I want those changes. Again, they are acting under that apparent or implied authority, but they are not the actual authority. So keep that in mind on who's telling you to do what. And if this becomes an issue, this is worth tracking, whether you're on a construction site and you do daily note logs, or just through the performance of the contract, where you then start conversing with your COR and your contracting officer to make sure that there is no confusion and direction of orders, that you are not being directed or your staff is not being directed to do work outside the contract scope because that a confusion of authority. So we kind of talked a bit about this, but here's the FAR defining authority. Contractors may have authority to enter into, administer, terminate contracts, make related determinations and findings. The critical part is contracting officers may bind the government only to the extent of the authority delegated to them. So keep that in mind too. The contracting officers have different warrant levels, and they can't act on a dollar amount. So if the contract changes might exceed their dollar authority, they might have to bring in a different contracting officer with a higher warranted amount. FAR 1.604 really defines what a contracting officer representative. And again, these letters of designation clearly define the limits of what they can and cannot do. And if you have been assigned a COR but have not received a designation letter, this should be one of those things that you are requesting from the contracting officer, if possible, before beginning performance or at the beginning of that contract. The moment you have that COR identified, you really do want to see their designation letter. That designation letter clearly defines the limit of the authority under that contract for that representative to give direction. In here, documentation of COR actions taken in accordance with delegation of authority. Change management process. Now the 6 steps contract change management process is something that I've pulled right out of this book by Gregory Garrett, Managing Contract Changes. And I've got the ordering numbers right here for this particular book. And in the book, they talk about these 6 steps. And I thought it was a really fabulous process. And I really found that book incredibly informative. So I don't think it was more than 20 something for the cost. But if you're interested, here's the ordering information. So in the book, they talk about the 6 steps. So step 1 is initiate the contract change. And again, that internal, external communication, how is the performance team impacted by the change? Part 2, or bullet 2 under step 1, clarification from the COR and the COTR. Because if they're the one that is saying, make this change, you want to make sure that you have that direction from them in writing, because that is what you're going to use to substantiate your request to the contracting officer. So if you get a verbal direction, you want to follow up with a text or an email, some way that you have that they can then say, yes, that is what I said, or no, that's not what I said. And then again, you need that verification authorization from the contracting officer. Because what we want is, once that representative has confirmed, yes, this change is needed, and we notify the contracting officer, then they can have their behind the closed door conversation and discussion of costs and why that change is necessary, while you then are doing your closed door work of how much is that going to cost us, how is that going to impact our time. So which rolls into number 2, plan the change. Develop your cost proposal, your performance timeline, and pull together your supporting documentation. 3, approve and negotiate the contract change. 4, have that change awarded, flow down changes to applicable subcontract agreements, and of course, notify both internal and external the parties that are involved in this contract so they can be aware that that change was incorporated. And again, when we're looking at that internal, if you are in a larger firm, and it's not just you as the owner operated wearing many, many hats, but if you are in a larger company and you do have a team, it's really important to develop a communication process internally and to have the accounting folks, have your contract administrator if you have one, cost estimator, those individuals that are involved in pulling that together to that solicitation process, and let them know that there's a change in process so the steps can be taken to track accordingly. Then we're going to administer the contract change, and of course we're going to close out contract change. So we're not talking about necessarily closing out the contract, but that change itself. If it is standalone in cost in nature and you've made sure that it's been billed and thus been paid, great. From an accounting perspective, we can call change number 1 of who knows how many may happen during the life of that contract, but then you can note that in your contract files as that change has been fully incorporated in that cost paid. So part of that contract change closeout process. So let's talk best practices here. Any questions, anyone thus far? So best practices, we want to develop and use a formal and disciplined contract management methodology. And again, these best practices I pulled right from this Managing Contract Change book. Develop and use a formal and disciplined contract management methodology. Now, I know for those of us that are doing day-to-day, the last thing we want is management to say, oh, we're incorporating a new process. There's now paperwork for you to do and track and make notes on for our day-to-day work activity. But having that process and that consistency of this process from contract to contract is the best way to make sure that you are not inadvertently losing money, losing your profit from contract performance. So part of that formal discipline contract methodology management starts with that solicitation process to contract closeout. So as you're putting that solicitation together, keeping track of all of those initial proposed costs, vendors, so again, you have those working papers until that contract closeout, because that's going to give you that comparison process for your proposed versus your actual. Any new contracts, incorporate that from all contracts moving forward. Incorporate it into your master subcontract agreements. Develop a teaming methodology. So as you're putting teams together, how are you as a team, whether a joint venture, whether a mentor protege, or just simply that prime sub, if your subcontractors are directed to make a change, have you guys determined how you want them to handle that change while performing as a sub on your contract? That teaming methodology, how are we going to go about it? Incorporating and capturing contract change data, discussions, communication exchange, cost, timeline, background on what initiated the change. Now, this is the support documentation that we have to build from a verbal conversation. So it does include that, and it can include a text, an email where somebody says, you know what, let's do this instead, and here's why. So from that time, all of that, especially if you have a fast-moving contract with a tight deadline, there is no extension, and you're coming back after completion, now trying to be made whole from those additional costs, from those incorporated changes that were made on the run. You might have to go back and build that timeline data. And I've worked with a lot of clients that were directed to do something that changed, that was truly out of scope work, but they didn't get the written confirmation, and suddenly they're coming back a year or 2 years later saying, you know, we did all this extra work and we didn't bill them, and now we want to request that. We want to get our final invoice, and we want to request to be paid for that additional work. But they're lacking the items that I mentioned. They don't have any proof of discussion. The individuals that told them to do the work have retired or left the agency, and they have no proof, and it's a little bit too little too late after the fact. And the odds of having that request for equitable adjustment accepted and being reimbursed for those change costs are very slight. So if you can capture that proof as it is happening real time and have a process of tagging it, printing it, having a folder, if you're, printer paper, or identifying, saving that into the contract communication file, develop that process so that you have the supporting document to go back, and if needed after the fact, after the contract has completed its scope, you can now discuss all of these changes that occurred. Ideally, that's not the best time, but sometimes that's just the reality of the performance for that particular contract. All right, next bullet. We want to provide training to all internal project team members on the formal contract methodology. So if you do have multiple project managers running different projects, you want to have some sort of continuity that is, this is part of our company process, so that we don't have to refigure out what we need to do depending on who the project manager was. We want to develop those processes and train our staff to have that continuity to make sure that we are capturing this data in a timely manner and methodology to make sure that we are not ultimately losing the cost that change may have triggered. We want to document and execute all contract changes through formal modifications to the contract. We really don't ideally want to wait until after the fact. Again, it happens, but we want to at least begin that conversation and keep that in that timely manner. You want to formally appoint individuals authorized to negotiate and award contract modification and reflect these appointments in the contract. So in your SAM profile, under those representation and certification, we have, I think it's even item number 1 in that first FAR response page. It says, who are the individuals authorized to delegate, that have been delegated or authorized to negotiate cost and price data. So right there is the start. If we are identifying those individuals, or those individuals change throughout the performance of the contract, just like the contracting officer, if they change out a COR, there should be a news designation letter. So if those individuals with that authority to negotiate and change, you should let the contracting officer know. And having a process for identifying that who internally has that responsibility. So if you have one main project manager and they're on vacation or just simply unavailable for whatever reason, that there is some sort of hierarchy of authority in place to be able to step in. Provide copies of the basic contract and all contract modifications to the entire performance team. I can tell you, in my 13 years here at PTAC, that I work with a lot of accounting staff that are trying to bill, and they're looking at changes in costs and they're trying to figure out, but the only thing that they have is they don't have the full contract. They don't have the amendment data. They don't see those contract line items. And we're trying to go back and figure out, how are we invoicing this if a contract's out of funds? Yet if they have that entire contract document, often I can then start working with them and we can take a look at it and say, okay, now we can see this, this, and this happened. Now we know how to invoice this contract against what line items. So trying to part out bits and pieces of the contract internally, or having those individuals that are responsible for an overall performance, that contract, if not directly, but in support of, they should also have that contract documentation and actually know what the contract looks like. So again, the stronger your internal team understands that contracting process, the more eyes to help you capture those changes, the better off you will be. Incorporate those change process within subcontract agreements. It's not necessarily the same as the flow down clauses. So the FAR matrix actually has which clauses are mandatory for primes to flow down to subcontractors. Not all clauses are flowed down, but having a change process identified, whether you use the same FAR clause or develop your own language, and if need be, work with an attorney, but having that process clearly defined as to how you want your subs to discuss contract change in what process, notification, cost, feature, time, all of that should be well defined within those subcontracts. And then last, periodically assess your organization's contract management process. So let's take a moment and talk about the FAR changes clause. See, I snuck the whole FAR conversation right back in on you just when you guys thought you were past it. The purpose of the FAR changes clause is 52-243-1. Serves four major purposes. And this, in fact, talking about this now is a great way to kind of summarize everything that we've been talking about. One, it provides operating flexibility by giving the government the unilateral right to order changes in the work to accommodate advances in technology and changes to the government need and requirement. So here's the benefit for the agency, operating flexibility. Two, it provides the contractor a means of proposing changes to work, thereby facilitating more efficient performance, improving the quality of contract and changes. So far we've been talking about government affected change, but what if you simply have a process, or through the performance, you suddenly develop and have a new concept, a new process, a new performance path, or you want to change out one product. Maybe there's a new product that I think you understand, but there's something that we want to propose that's different. So this changes clause, again, provides the contractor a means of proposing changes within the work, not necessarily reactionary, but getting ahead of and say, hey, you know what, we think we might have a better idea. Three, to furnish procurement authority to the contracting officer to order additional work within the general scope of the contract without using the procedures for a new procurement. So this goes back to where we're talking about, is that a cardinal change or is it a reasonable extension of the contract? So the changes clause allows the contracting officer to make that determination. And four, it provides a legal means by which the contractor may process claims through the administrative disputes process. So it really covers a lot. And again, this is kind of a nice time to stop and look at the clause again after our discussion of what to do when we have contract change. The changes clause entitles the contractor to an equitable adjustment to the contract if the change results in a change in contract, and it impacts either cost, whether it increases or decreases in time of performance. So let's talk about response time. So in the changes fixed price, and keep in mind the language changes a bit dependent upon the contract type, whether it was a fixed cost, or cost reimbursable, or a time and material contract. Those were the three main that we saw earlier in this webinar. It says the contracting officer may at any time by written order and without notice to the sureties, case of construction, if any, make change with the general scope of the contract in any one or more of the following: drawings, designs, method of shipment, packet, place of delivery. B, of course, such changes can cause an increase or decrease in the cost or the time required for performance of any work. Okay. Whether or not changed by the order, the contracting officer make an equitable adjustment in the contract price, delivery schedule, or both, and shall modify the contract. And note it says increase or decrease because the government the needs for that agency may change, and so they can decrease the overall scope. So we talked about what to do when they decide to increase it, but also they can decrease it. So C, the contractor must assert its right to an adjustment under this clause within 30 days from the date of receipt of the written order. However, if the contracting officer decides that facts justify it, the contracting officer may receive and act upon a proposal submitted before final payment of the contract. Okay, we're building up some methodology when we get into those requests for equitable adjustment. And of course, we have D and E. The contractor proposal includes costs made obsolete or in excess by the change. Now we kind of talk about what to do for disposition of property or decrease. All right. Failure to agree to any adjustment shall be a dispute under the disputes clause. However, nothing in this clause shall excuse the contractor from proceeding with the contract as changed. So, as far as cause constructive change, and again, a little bit of definology before we start talking about equitable adjustment and disputes. What am I doing for time? Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's just constructive change defines as informal customer actions or inactions not initially identified or admitted to be changes, but which require extra work. Constructive change, government's reinterpretation, defective specs, government's interference or failure to cooperative, constructive change. So something happened that created or caused this change. It is a constructive change. And this terminology is important. Failure to disclose, acceleration. So the agency comes back and says, nope, we need to have it done faster. Typically involves holding schedule after excusable delays, such as COVID and all the things beginning of 2020 when COVID hit. We had all of our excusable delays, yet we still had to have work completed on time. So that is a constructive change. It impacts your cost and performance timelines. Contractor must assert excusable day and request extensions under acceleration. Impossibility of performance, again, constructive changes. Act of over-inspection or unreasonable approval times. So sometimes we have overzealous agency employees, and I have heard some really great stories that I'm not going to go into now just simply because I am running out of time. But it comes down to the contractor performs work beyond that required by the contract without a formal change order, and such work was informally ordered by the government or is caused by the government fault. A constructive change has occurred, not an express change, which is not acknowledged normally in writing. So express change is, again, in writing. Those are the things that we've had the discussion with the contracting officer. It was acknowledged, it was negotiated, it was modified and incorporated into the contract. These constructive changes are the more common ones that kind of happen on the fly, and sometimes where we are not necessarily realizing that we are having cost and impact changes because they may seem even reasonable, but they can add up. So let's talk about requests for equitable adjustments. So an REA is a good request for an equitable adjustment establishes 4 things. Entitlement to the adjustment based on a government act or failure to act, damages in the form of an increase in the cost or time of performance, a causal link between the act or failure to act and the damages, and proof of the amount of damages. So again, a good REA has addressed those 4 issues. Here's a great suggested format. Introduction, what is impact, cost, or time, and state specific consideration. And again, we address that term, money and or time. And statement of facts. Describe what the agency did or failed to do that caused the change. So if we had requested confirmation of a proposed change and we're told to not move any further in production work until that was resolved, now we have something where failure caused that. We failed to get a yes or no and didn't get that continuation, no, don't change, continue to perform. 2, again, the statement of facts, explain how the act impacted performance, increased cost, time, performance objectives. must prove cause to effect link. And 3, explain how you estimated or measured the effect of the act or the failure to act on a cost and or time. And B, how the government's act or omission was a breach of contract, and identify the contract term which it was inconsistent. So the conclusion, reiterate your REA is an adjustment to the contract price or time of performance. The introduction, the why we feel this way, and conclusion. And this format needs to include these 4 items. So an REA is not a claim. REAs are submitted under the changes clause. If an REA is denied, the next step would be a claim. So let's talk about claims. And I'm going to not spend a whole lot of time on this process. If you note here, got my little icon, this was my reminder. Again, I have a webinar coming up January 12th from noon to 1. It's a free webinar, and this is going to be an hour-long discussion with an attorney specifically about REAs. And I have the information here on that workshop in just another slide. So we go, REA is not a claim. They're submitted under the changes clause. The changes clause gives us that contractual authority under which to submit the claim. If it's denied, then we're going to move into a claim process. So a claim is a formal claim is a written specific demand for payment or money, adjustment of contract terms that is submitted under the disputes clause. So REAs are tied to the changes clause. Claims are tied to the disputes clause. A formal claim must arise from a dispute, and we're disputing that we are owed money, and the government said, no, you're not. Now we have a dispute, and we're going to issue a claim under that disputes clause. A formal claim must be certified that the claim is made in good effort, over $100,000. Specify the relief required, and again, relief, time and or money. Assert specific rights. We're going to have our supporting documentation. We're going to request a contracting officer's final decision, and we're going to clearly indicate the amount of remuneration required. Again, remuneration can be time and or money. So time and additional funds, additional time, or just additional funds. Okay, importance of documentation. So again, that's really all I'm going to talk about for REAs and claims, and I really do hope that you all join us for Howard Roth's presentation on how to get paid for under REAs and all of the legal impacts that you might have. It's going to be a great webinar on January 12th. Okay, importance of documentation. So contract documentation, and really what we're talking about, this is what we are holding as our example. We have to have this as our proof of that process. So contract documentation means all documents which form part of, constitute, or evidence the contract, including those conditions and quotations, offers, order, acknowledgments of an order, acceptance, and specifications of the purchaser or seller, and any document referred to in any of them. Okay, big mouthful. Again, legal definitionary from a law's website. Documentation. Documents include both pre-award and post-award documents. So pre-award is the proposal, your pre-solicitation communication, your emails, those questions and answers, quotes from subs, suppliers, working documents, etc. Post-award, again, emails, communication, daily journal, logs, invoices, text messages, and text messages are now allowable as evidence in a legal proceeding. Contract and final proposal, timesheets, meeting minutes, expense reports, travel documents, internal reimbursement papers, and anything that can provide proof of effort. These documentations become a supporting narrative and provide evidence to be used to justify cost and or time impact. If you have a case where your COR is saying, I didn't do any of that, and you're trying to convince the contracting officer they did, This type of communication and timelines and following up communication with emails to be confirmed or denied or clarified becomes really important in putting together that proof as to why you have a valid request for equitable adjustment or to support a claim under the Disputes Act. So, phew, a lot of information. Questions, anyone? I've been doing a lot of talking and throwing a lot of information at you. All right, so let me go ahead and in conclusion. So change happens, period. We've seen enough memes over the years, change happens. If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail, by Benjamin Franklin. Develop an internal process for identifying when a potential change is triggered. Have your methodologies include those internal and external communication processes. Subset of project accounting codes and project codes to track change impact. So have an accounting process to be able to track those costs. Verify all phone conversations with an email. And just, for example, this email is just to recap our earlier telephone conversation. I understood that you requested this. Is this correct? Get that confirmation in writing. Educate your team on types of authority so they can recognize when and how they should respond to those hidden constructive changes. Ensure good communication with your contracting officer. Don't rely on their representative to provide all of the communication to the CO on your behalf. So even if you have a good relation with your COR, you don't know what type of relationship the COR has with your contracting officer. Make sure you are including them in that conversation. Ensure, excuse me one second. Ensure good communication with your contracting officer. Okay, we kind of repeated that. Worth restating. Follow up and verify. And that applies whether it's the agency, your subs, the prime. Follow up and verify. Know your contract and know the scope so that it's easy to identify when requirements are being stretched or inflated out of contract scope. And this really does tie back to this next bullet. Ask clarifying questions during the solicitation phase. Don't go into awarded contract with assumptions. And of course, you know what they say about assumptions. Makes it, yeah, out of you and me. But again, it's really easy for vague or obtuse language for scope of work. If your language says, we'll provide reports on, does those reports include modifications and revisions and final reports and review it again, then more requests, more. Make sure that you don't have that ambiguous language in your contract where it's easy for the contracting officer to come back and say, no, that isn't a change, that's clearly in the contract. Clarify that during the solicitation phase. And document everything, daily notes, weekly journals, updated project status. Know when something is going off the predetermined and pre-priced plan. And often, especially if you have scope work where you have field staff where people are, busy, engaged in day-to-day activity, asking them to write up or recap. No one likes paperwork, but it's really critical for trying to identify what happened when and to provide that supporting documentation. We need to be able to support that when we are asking for that additional consideration. All right. So next in the series, I'm calling it part 2 of the managing contract changes. And again, this is Howard's webinar, Getting Paid on Government Contracts, Fresh Strategies on REA and Claims. And he and I have talked quite a bit about this. So I think it's going to be a fabulous webinar. The link to register is right there. You can go right to the PTAC eCenter and register, or email me if you're having problems. But this is not going to be a repeated workshop, so I can't guarantee we're going to have it more than once. So absolutely you want to catch that. Not often that we get a really great attorney giving their time, volunteering their time to discuss an important topic. So just again, January 12th, noon to 1, please sign up now. So thank you, everyone. I've got about 5 minutes left. We've really talked about a lot of information. I'm going to kind of hop back to my conclusions here. Does anyone have any questions? And granted, I realize what I'm talking about is, again, one of those where it sounds great on paper, but it's really challenging to incorporate into a really busy day-to-day schedule. But again, identify those plans, incorporate those plans, and give your staff, train them on building these processes so that we're not in that circumstance of trying to cover additional claims after a contract work has been completed. Because often, especially if there's a long delay in requesting those changes, the further away from contract completion when we request those additional funds, those REAs, the harder it is to substantiate and have them come through as an agreed and paid. Well, with that, I'd like to thank everyone and remind you, if you have any questions or if you have in a particular activity that you'd like to ask questions about on a one-on-one basis, feel free to reach out to PTAC. We are here to help. And granted, while we're not attorneys, often we can really help you talk through and talk about putting that supporting documentation together, working on that request for equitable adjustment, or have that discussion with you, is it really a time for you to bring in an attorney if you're moving into this disputes process? If there are no further questions, I'd like to again say thank you everyone for joining me today. Have a fabulous week. Happy holidays. And at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending.